Wow. I think I got it to Zoom to do live on YouTube. Let me see if I can make it do live on Facebook. Wow. I think I got it to Zoom to do live on YouTube. So there is a time delay. Facebook. Wow. I think I got it to Zoom uh, do
Can you hear me? Cannot hear you. Can't hear me. I can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can
Can you
hear
hear me
you.
now? Okay, okay.
That was weird.
Um, I'm looking
So
on
is
my
it already,
phone to see if I
is,
can.
yeah, is it already broadcasting on Facebook?
It's
Let
not
me
on
look.
Facebook.
Oh, it's on YouTube.
Yeah, I can't tell. Okay,
It looks
yeah, we're
like,
live. Yeah, we're live. It's only showing one of us at a time, though. How do we make it switch there? Maybe it'll switch
I
there.
don't know.
It's got lag time.
Yeah.
So it's not going to be, when we record these, we don't start until we press record, but I guess it's,
When it's live,
since it's
you
live.
started with,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, well.
So I'm going to hit record
hopefully
now.
We're not recording this. Oh, okay.
Well, I think if it's streaming live on Zoom, then on YouTube, I think it's recording on YouTube. But
Yeah.
I'm gonna click record on the call. So if
Good.
you're out there watching, or you're watching later, most likely, we are using Zoom, but trying to stream it to YouTube and Facebook. We're pretty sure it's not streaming to Facebook, but it is streaming to YouTube. But we don't know if it's recording on YouTube. So I'm gonna hit record on my end, and
Yeah, when I
we
click,
are now recording. We are now
when I
recording.
click yeah. Okay, I can't tell if it's live on YouTube or not. I mean, I clicked the link you put
I can
on
tell.
Facebook. Can you tell? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at any rate, so
why don't you introduce us, do a little introduce yourself, and then tell what the topic is.
Yeah, so I am Dana Bennett Kaywood, the oldest sibling of three. Blue is the second sibling of three. And we've made this page, Sibling Rivalry, to discuss topics of interest in the world today. And today's topic is pros and cons to dismantling the Department of Education. And so we expect this to be a lively discussion. We both did some research, and before we get started, I'm going to give my sources. I looked at lots of places: the History Channel, WhiteHouse.gov, Education Week, EveryChildSucceeds.org, EverythingPolicy.org, U.S. News and World Report, and WKRN News from Nashville, Century Foundation, National Education Association, Professional Educators of Tennessee, the Tennessean, and NPR. So I used a lot of resources, and I didn't really find different stories in any of them. So they all kind of said the same thing. So Drew, do you want to talk a little bit, give a very brief history of the Department of Ed, or do you want me to?
So you might have read more of the history than I did. I read somewhere it started back in the 1800s, and it didn't become cabinet level until the Carter administration, and then Republicans have talked about dismantling it ever since then. I personally think that Republicans in general, whether it's the topic of abortion or stuff like dismantling the Department of Education, I think they historically use that kind of talk to rally the troops and try to get votes, as opposed to any real intention to do those things. But now they're actually happening. But as far as history of it, why don't you get into that, because I'm guessing you know more than me.
I don't know that I know more, but I did type it up. So the very first Department of Federal Education was established during Andrew Johnson's presidency in 1867. James Garfield introduced the bill, but it only lasted about a year because of politics surrounding Reconstruction efforts, even though illiteracy was high, especially in the South. And so what they thought then is that, and what was causing the controversy then, is that many considered it an overreach of federal power and an unnecessary investment. So at that point, education came under the Department of the Interior. Now, that original department collected statistics and facts that showed the progression of education in several states. Eventually, it was renamed the Bureau of Education, and it still was largely an information-gathering entity. But in the early to mid 1900s, targeted legislative acts impacted education. And this included the National Defense Education Act of 1958, which gave increased funding to science education because of the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik. That role expanded in 1965 when Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. At this point, classrooms and schools were given federal dollars. Now, prior to 1979, most education activity was housed in the old Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Then fast forward to what Drew was saying, the modern Department of Education was established by Jimmy Carter in 1979. Very quickly after Reagan became president, he wanted to dismantle it to reduce the budget and ensure that local and state needs were determining education overall rather than the federal government. He did not have congressional support. So since then, there have been numerous acts that have been passed. So we'll get to that in a minute. Do you want to talk about any of the acts? Such as
I would say, why do you think that Carter felt like it needed to be its own department?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Did you find anything about that, about why Carter felt that need?
Yeah. It was a loaded question. You just gave me a loaded gun.
Well,
so you got to remember the times. We're coming out of the 60s, the 70s. So you had a number of different pieces of civil rights legislation passed. What?
Look at your phone. Look at your phone.
Yeah.
And then keep going.
Why do I need to look at my phone and keep going?
You're getting lower and lower. You're like this.
Oh. Oh, sorry. So it's my setup is kind of weird because I've got a big screen up here, but if I look at it, the camera's down here, and if I look at this, then if I look straight at the camera, then I just kind of lose sight of everything else. But I know I should look at the camera because then it looks like I'm looking at you. So anyway, Carter made the Department of Education separate because there was really gross inequality in school systems around the country after all the civil rights legislation. You had clearly still today, public schools are largely funded by state and local taxes, property tax in specific. So in areas with lower property values, you have less property tax to support the schools. Mm-hmm. So the Department of Education, part of what it does, I think, is Title I funding. Is it Title I funding that tries to kind of equalize some of that spend and give some underprivileged areas some extra funding?
Yeah, so Title I disperses funds to elementary and secondary schools with large, low-income student enrollments.
Right. And then it also does college loans, the FAFSA. It's really interesting to me. I would almost say that primary and secondary education is, I don't want to say it's more important than college, but kind of. And yet the Department of Education, a whole lot of the money goes to the college level as opposed to the primary and secondary level. Again, it's about equalizing that. It's about helping those students with disabilities, that kind of thing. So it's, I think the funding is, I absolutely don't have a problem with the funding. I think we need to help areas that are in economically dire situations where they can't properly fund their school system. I mean, those kids need education too. And I think it's kind of shortchanging society in general if everybody doesn't have a good chance at an education. Mm-hmm. And it costs money to educate, bottom line.
Yeah, so the other things that the Department of Education does, besides what you've mentioned, They do collect data on schools, and they oversee the recognition of accrediting agencies and programs that support higher institutions, higher education, and they protect students against racial and sex-based discrimination.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, continue on.
Continue on. So I really don't know where to continue. We've kind of talked about, that's what the Department of Education does.
Yeah.
This whole thing with ending the Department of Education, I think it's one of those things, and we had a brief discussion before we came on the air, and you could take all those functions and put them into different departments. I think that would make it harder for state and local education systems to interact, because now instead of the Department of Education to interact with, now you've got, whether it's the Department of Labor, the Department of Justice, the Department of this or the Department of that, you've got a lot more points of contact instead of just one department. So I think it makes it a little more complicated for local schools and school districts to interact with the federal government. The other thing is just kind of is what's going on with the downsizing of the Department of Education. What's the plan for what's next? I mean, with a lot of the stuff that's going on, downsizing, whether it's the Department of Education, whether it's the USAID, whether it's any number of parts of the government right now, what's the plan beyond the teardown?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we don't know.
Right. So there are a few things that we do know, but I want to back up just a little bit. I think a lot of people in our viewing audience have probably heard of No Child Left Behind that George W. Bush instituted. And the goal was that the federal government held schools accountable for student outcomes. And all the students had to meet state-set standards. And then, so that was George W. Bush. By the time President Obama came in, he replaced that with what's called Every Student Succeeds Act. And that is a lot of what the Department of Education does, is based upon the act. They help disadvantaged and high-need students. There was a requirement to teach high academic standards, statewide assessments, and the accountability for the assessments moves to the states, and they have to report to the government every 2 years. If the school is underperforming, they can lose some or all of their federal funding. So the state turns in their accountability plan to the Department of Education, and then they do this every 2-year reporting. But this act, Every Student Succeeds Act, also gives access to high-quality preschool and gives grants to districts serving low-income students. Federal money goes toward textbooks and library books and special education centers. And as we mentioned earlier, scholarships. Now, one thing that's important to note is that, and I found different percentages on different websites, but typically they were in the 10 to 12% range. All the rest of the funding comes from state and local governments. So when we're talking about disbanding the Department of Education, we're talking about that 10 to 12% financially. So, Drew, tell me one con that you think is negative about disbanding in terms of a local school. What's a negative about disbanding?
Well, I mean, like I said before, if you've got the Department of Education, you've essentially got one organization you're aiming your contact at, as opposed to multiple different government organizations. I mean, even within the Department of Education, I'm sure you don't have just one phone line to call in with all your trouble. It's I guess the biggest con is that, lower income districts could really be hurt by this. And I mean, right now I feel like we have probably a multi-tiered educational system where in the wealthier type of area you're at, the better your education system is going to be. And the more disadvantaged, economic area you're in, the worse the education system is going to be. And so if that extra funding is pulled away from those lower socioeconomic areas, they're going to be even worse than they are now. I think that's the major thing.
Okay. So let me look right here. Yeah, so like you said, the low-income families are receiving help through Title I of the ESEA, which that is the Every Student Succeeds Act. So typically what the students get, the schools get through this is educational technology, remedial instruction materials, internet services, and mental health services. Now, as Drew and I discussed on the phone earlier, many people think that if the Department of Education does dissolve, then funding would move to block grants, which would still provide that money, just as Drew said, not through all of one course of action. You might have to do several steps. So I really looked up the
block. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was moving on to my next point. I was just going to say.
So block grants historically, I think, are very problematic because they typically fund things at a level below where they need to be funded, and then they're not adjusted for inflation properly. So over time, they create more and more of a budgetary problem. This would be a state budgetary problem and local budgetary problem because, again, most of the extra funding, most of the regular funding comes from state and local governments. So those state and local governments are going to face more and more of a shortfall over time if the block grants continue as they historically have been. Block grants historically don't come with as many strings attached, which on one hand could be a good thing if you have wise ethical leadership, in your state and local government. But block grants also, since they have less strings attached historically, money gets peeled away more easily for purposes other than what it was intended to do. So, the idea that, well, we can have all the same funding, it'll just be block grants instead of the way it is now. That just is, to me, it's not just kicking the can down the road, it's making things worse long term. It's a short-term monetary savings for long-term financial pain and probably worse results.
So I did look up just now to get the exact definition of a block grant, and it is a fixed amount of federal funds given to state or local governments to administer and provide specific services or benefits. The concept is that local authorities are better equipped to handle local issues. They are more flexible than categorical grants, which have stricter guidelines and are for specific purposes. Block grants allow recipients to allocate resources based on their priorities and have less oversight from the larger government, which is exactly what you said. And yeah, so depending on your view of what I just read, again, that's putting it back in the hands of local municipalities. And are they responsible? I guess it depends on where you live, as we said earlier. And so another con that I put is that there's less structure for SPED programs, because therefore, some states would allocate less spending than others because each state is doing their own thing. Some think that students with disabilities who have fewer resources, larger class sizes, and fewer special education services. This is a core responsibility of the Department of Education, but they do answer to a program called Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And of course, as we mentioned before, it's believed by a lot of people that moving it to another entity is going to have a drastic and immediate impact on students with disabilities. So that's another
Good or
con. That is a con.
Okay. Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of people, let me see if I wrote something similar to that on the pros. So on the, taking that same topic, the pro to dismantling the Department of Education is that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act will continue to ensure that those with disabilities get a free education tailored to their needs. About 12 to 13% of their money for the disabilities part comes from the federal government. Again, if the Department of Education is dissolved, it's likely to go back to the state as block grants, and the federal accountability for compliance would disappear. And so, you know, I guess if a person looks at it as a pro or con, is that good or bad? Depends on your viewpoint of if you want the federal government to have oversight into that issue, any of these issues we're talking about. I mean, I think a lot of it boils down in the Department of Education to, even though it's 10 to 12% of the money is from the federal government and all the rest is state and local, a lot of people believe that even that it's not because of the percent of money, it's because of their influence. Because the states know that they have to meet certain parameters in order to get federal funding, or even though that's a small percentage, but they want to do what the federal government says in order to get that. And so to give you an example on, and let's not take a tangent here, but this is an example, vouchers. So a lot of people who are conservative will not take the vouchers, even if that goes through. And that is because they don't want to answer to the federal government for the money that they received. And I think it's the same way here with people who believe that the Department of Education being dismantled is a positive thing. They have that same viewpoint. You take the money from the government and you have to do things their way to some degree or another. That, I think, in a nutshell, is where the controversy lies.
Yeah, I think the idea that conservatives are against vouchers is like you're smoking weed or something. I mean, vouchers are the conservative people's wet dream. I mean, they're all over vouchers. You know, I mean, it's a takeaway. In my view, it's a takeaway from the public schools to be able to give it to private schools or charter schools. And you know, the pulling back from the Department of Education, you know, it probably does open the door for more voucher programs and for more charter schools. And it's just a way to make money off of education. You know, education is, you know, again, I think we touched on it last week. Just there are some in our society that feel like, you know, everything should be privatized, everything should have a capitalist bent to it, and you know, capitalism doesn't solve all the ills of society. And public education, I think, is very necessary. Are there, you know, people who want to, you know, homeschool, people who want their kids to go to private school? Hey, that's fine. That's your decision. But I think we need to have well-funded public schools because the majority of people can't afford that, don't have the time for that, don't have the expertise for that. You know, I think the public education system has really helped America, you know, become what America is. You know, obviously, if the Department of Education was created in part because there was a lot of inequalities due to race, socioeconomic factors, etc., you know, those are things that we still clearly need work on. They'll always need work on. And I don't think this moves us in what is happening now, I don't think moves us in any kind of positive direction, because we have no idea really what we're working towards. We think it'll be block grants. It might be block grants. It might not be block grants. What are the rules? You know, there's no one out there in this administration saying this is our view of the future. It's just, let's destroy and then something will happen. So I think it's very problematic.
Yeah, I hear you. So let me find my note. Okay, this is something that the federal government has said, that all statutory programs that fall under the Department of Education's purview will continue, and that includes student loans, Pell Grants, and funding for special needs students, and grant making. So I think some of the things that people are afraid of disappearing, they have already identified that at least those things are those are the things that I found consistently from one website to another website. So I feel like that was accurate. I think, well, now let me form this as a question. Do you think that as history passes, as we go through time, it is smart to at least review what the current educational policies are in order to decide on improvements and identify?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so I think almost anybody would agree to that. And so,
but that's not what's happening, though. Let's be clear. That is not what's happening.
Right. But if you look at the history, so I went over the history at the very beginning, and we can see that there are chunks of time in which things have changed. Now, I do think there's a lot of improvement that's needed in the school system. As you know, I chose to homeschool, and that was one reason. There were multiple reasons, so I'm not going to lump them all in that. But I felt like, at least when we first started homeschooling, that I would be able to personalize an education for my children. And that's something you can't do in a group. I mean, you can't do that in a large group, not easily. So let me see what other cons I wrote down.
I believe when you first started homeschooling, y'all lived in Arkansas, and it seems like they were still busing, and yet your kids were going to have to be bused like an hour and a half away or something like that. And that was one of the original impetuses to homeschool.
You're right. They had just opened Bill Clinton Elementary, and they wanted people from all different backgrounds to go to that school. You know, they wanted, and in order to do that, they had to reach beyond that Little Rock area. So anyway, that was definitely one reason. Now, I'm going to read to you another con that I put, and you can comment.
Okay.
Low-income students could see their schools lose teachers and counselors, cut mental health programs, and be unable to afford new books and classroom materials. Did you read anything about that? Do you think this will progress the losing of teachers?
Sure it will. I thought I'd already expressed that. 10% of a budget doesn't sound like a huge amount, 10 to 12%. But when you're talking, these school systems are, hundreds of millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars. 10% is a big chunk of change. That could be salaries for 20 teachers.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it could cause all sorts of problems.
So
yeah.
the friends I have that are our age, as
Mm-hmm.
would be different from younger, newer teachers. But the friends I have that are our age that are public school teachers, not counselors, but teachers, seem to
Okay,
be
yeah.
largely dissatisfied with the status quo. And many of them,
Sure.
many of my friends are moving out of the public school brick and mortar system. Some of them are teaching online. Some of them are teaching in private schools, et cetera. Some of them have, retired just to get out of the system.
Right.
So I think what you and I both agree upon is that there need to be some changes. Public school system needs to be better across the board. It needs to meet the needs of lower income students. I think we both agree on that. And the other issues that it has.
Let me ask you, if you've got a school that's struggling, how do you, what kind of policy, what do you do to help that school move its students in the right direction?
Well, that's a good question. I think that just giving everybody a test, a standardized test, is not the answer. That is
No, it's not the answer.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the picture. I mean, you can see what kind of scores everybody's making. But personally, I would think that if someone, you have your teachers and you have your principals and you keep going up the ladder and you get somebody up there to go to the school that's failing and observe them for a period of time and identify, is it behavior problems? Is it that kids are coming to school not prepared because their parents don't work with them in the evenings? What is the problem? Because what's the problem in East Tennessee may not be the problem in inner city Chicago. And so I think that we've really got to, and that's where people think that going to state-led programs is going to assist in doing that. Because all the needs are different. We're just all different. But if we were to keep it at a federal level.
What I would say is that the educational needs are the same, not the needs to overcome the problems, and the problems may be different. I've read about a number of schools where, this one principal found like a lot of kids were skipping. And it turns out that a lot of them were so low income, their parents didn't have access to washers and dryers, and they didn't want to come to school in stinky, dirty clothes. So he got a grant or something and has a laundromat in the basement. Another principal at some other school found that a lot of his kids were having problems because they had like horrible teeth. And so he got a bunch of dentists in the area to volunteer their time and come to work on the kids' teeth at the school, which sounds hideous, but they got past it. They weren't in pain while they were in class, and their schools improved.
So that's the kind of thing I think that could be identified at a local and state level. But I like the point that you said is, are they going to be responsible to do that? Obviously, in the examples you just said, they were, because that washer and dryer and that dental care didn't come from the federal government, likely. It probably came from a local source, volunteering, potentially. So I think if
probably outside of the school system, local, state, federal, probably came from outside entirely.
And I think
I want to throw one other thing in. So, okay, you get kids who are you get those issues resolved, the dirty clothes, the teeth, the whatever. So the kids are showing up to school. If you've got kids that are performing, kind of below grade level or whatever, I personally think the research I have seen is that one of the keys educationally is smaller class sizes. And it doesn't have to be smaller class sizes. It's more, I'm trying to think how it's worded, basically more instructor time per student. and that can be
Mhm.
done with a longer class year, a longer day, lower class sizes, any of those kind of combinations. Think
Mhm.
about, so our brother went to West Point, and at West Point, you've got some big lecture classes, I'm sure, as freshmen and stuff like that. But you've got a lot of classes that are a dozen people in the class. So
Mhm.
is it any wonder that people come out of a school like that looking like brainiacs because they've had a lot of one-on-one time with an
Mhm.
instructor? So if you've got a kid who's not a kid, but a whole school full of kids who have challenges at home, all sorts of different issues, getting those class sizes smaller and smaller, I think is a key thing to increasing their academic output, so to speak.
Well, I
And
agree with you on most subjects in school if they could be done. And the thing is that requires more teachers, probably bigger
mhm.
schools. All of those things. It does make it. I agree with what you're saying, but I think it's hard to accomplish.
Oh, sure, yeah,
Financially.
it's going to cost
Yeah,
more money.
yeah, yeah. So, you know, one of the things that I did in preparing for this, let me back up first. One of the things that I wanted to say, I was wondering about school meals and how they would be affected by dismantling the Department of Education. But the
Right.
school meals are funded and paid for by USDA's Food and Nutrition Service. And in Tennessee, we tie in the free and reduced lunches to SNAP benefits. And guess what? It's not working really well. There are backlogs, processing errors, and system overhauls that have taken place. There are routinely mishandled documents, vital paperwork is lost, and even benefit applications have been terminated without interviewing applicants. So the point being
hang on, are you telling me that the Republicans that have been in charge of Tennessee for years and years are not good administrators? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, it is what you're hearing me say. This needs to be overhauled. I 100% think the public school system needs to be overhauled. Whether
but we talked earlier too about every time you turn around, they're trying to reorganize and overhaul, and it doesn't ever seem to go anywhere.
Right, it doesn't seem to go anywhere, and so I wonder where the breakdown is. Is the breakdown that the wrong people are administering the plan, the different plans for each locale, or is it that the breakdown occurs in the schools themselves? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple different things I'll say here. So one, we've talked. This is going to seem like a tangent, but I'm going to bring it back around. I promise. So we've talked a couple times about how much money is in politics. So I've read several articles that indicate it's actually easier and cheaper to buy politicians at the state and local level than it is at the federal level. So that really makes throws a different light on.
I'm going to go check my green beans. I'm still talking, but I got to go check my green beans. Hang on.
Okay.
Okay. So you said.
So another thing about state and local schools, as far as being administered and stuff, is it's local politics, and you got good old boy networks and stuff like that. Here in Lenoir City, when we got to Lenoir City and Andrew started elementary school, our youngest, he's 19 now, but when he started, the local elementary school, he's the oldest, not my youngest. So anyway, the local elementary school was ranked as one of the top 3 in the state. An elementary school in Lenoir City, Tennessee, ranked as one of the top 3 in the state. Well, they had 2 principals who were just dynamic leaders and just really passionate about education. And And essentially, they have gotten moved on from being principals to doing other stuff in the central office. And now the lady who's the principal now, she's nice, she's fine, but she doesn't have that passion and that drive that these other two had. And the school's, gone way down. And if you ask her, she'll say it's because, our demographics have changed. And it's like they didn't change that much from one year to the next. And the drop off was pretty much that one went out and you came in.
Yeah. Well, I would
and
say
she may hear this or not.
Well, I would say that there is a chance that some demographics have changed since COVID because a lot of people have moved into our state from other states.
Yeah. Well, this was before COVID. This was well before COVID.
Okay. Well, so you identified one big thing, and I think that's passion from our teachers. And I think that, when we start in elementary school and you decide what do you want to be when you grow up, and then that morphs when you get in high school and learn a few more things. And then you go to college and you start looking at things like how much money am I going to earn in that occupation? And what kind of politics am I going to have to, or red tape, I should say, am I going to have to go through in order to be good at my job? And I think that a lot of people are leaving the teaching profession or not even starting in the teaching profession.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And that doesn't help matters because we don't have as many of those passionate teachers.
Right. Yeah. If you can be passionate about what you're doing, and you can be passionate about being a doctor, being a lawyer, being a teacher, it's like, okay, well, I can make $500,000 or $250,000 or $50,000. Gee, I wonder which one I'll go with. There's a school in Chicago I've read about several times, and I don't remember if it's a public school or private school. I think it's a public school with like a lot of extra local funding from outside the system, and like the teachers there make like $100,000 a year. The principal there, the base salary is like 85, like less than the teacher. Now if the school hits certain metrics, then the principal can end up making more than the teachers, but the base salary is actually less. And
that's interesting.
That school's, from what I've read, their academic programs, they kick butt year after year after year after year because they've got great, if you're a teacher, hey, and you can go there and make $100,000, guess where I'm going to try to go. So they've got lots of competition from really good teachers wanting to get into that school. So money is part of the problem. It's not the whole problem because I don't think we can pay every teacher nationwide $100,000. It'd be nice, but here in Lenoir City, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you also can't make a blanket statement that everybody should earn the same thing because the cost of living is more in some areas than the others. But
sure, yeah.
So we have been going 44 minutes, and I want to tell you this story.
Tell me a story.
I talked to a friend of mine who's a teacher, and I asked them their thoughts on the Department of Education being disbanded. And basically what was told to me is that, you have 180 days to teach, and you have to teach 70 standards here in the state of Tennessee. Now, TCAPs are over at the beginning of May. So after the beginning of May, after TCAPs are over, you really don't count those other days because you're not trying to achieve a metric on the test. So when you start with 180 days, you're basically down now to 150 teaching days. During that 150 teaching days, they have to administer 3 required benchmarks. That lessens their teaching time down to 120 days. You add in their time off and breaks, then they're down to 110 days. Then the first month of school is introductory material and review material from the previous calendar year, depending on what grade level they're in. Now they're down to 90 days. So
Mm-hmm.
this teacher told me that basically when you come down to it, they have 90 focused teaching days. And this person has to teach a new standard every day. And after spring break, they have roughly 2 weeks to review all 70 standards before the TCAPs begin. And all of this puts unrealistic expectations on both teachers and students. And so my question was to this person, are all of these testing requirements coming from the federal government or the state? And the answer is they are coming from the state that answers to the federal. And that is, all of this is part of the problem. This person didn't say this, I'm saying this, because this teacher and many other teachers feel like they're teaching to the test because they have to meet these particular benchmarks and standards. They cannot individualize instruction, as we previously mentioned. And so all that's happening is they're trying to regurgitate material in order to pass the test, or not just pass it, but to do well. And so I think that as we're thinking through, all of this stuff, I think we have to consider that just because it seems like a state requirement doesn't mean the federal government doesn't affect it. And I just got a text from somebody, and so I'm probably going to have to let you go.
Okay.
Something.
So you know, I would some of what you said there. Like, I know one of the federal requirements is your state has to have an assessment and some metrics. The state decides it, but you've got to have some assessments. You got to have some metrics. You got to tell us what they are. So you know, is that a bad thing? I mean, it kind of makes sense that there should be some sort of standardized thing so we can measure localities, states, cities against each other to see where weak spots are. But I also agree it's gotten to be way too much, because I do feel like they're teaching to the test and they're not really educating. I think, you know, these multiple choice tests are a bunch of BS. I think there should be, if you look at other countries, there should be a lot more essays, a lot more emphasis on thinking skills instead of guessing skills.
Yeah. And those are hard to measure on a test. So I lost my thoughts, and my mind is distracted.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Department of Education providing extra funding for those areas that are economically disadvantaged, for students with special needs, handling, you know, some of the, I forget what you touched on there at the beginning, basically racial and sexual, you know, issues and stuff like that. Yeah. You know, I think those jobs need to be done. You know, and whether they're in the Department of Education or some other department, you hypothetically could need the exact same number of people. So I think that from what reading I did, and I think from what comments you've made too, I think the core missions of the Department of Education are fine. I don't think they are from what I've read, I don't think they're as heavy-handed on states and local governments as even I thought they were. You know, are there some strings attached? There are some.
Yeah, the strings attached, I think, is the hard part for teachers, because that gets back to the testing issue. And while the states determine the test, I mean, they can pick their own test, but they have to pick a test that meets the federal government's guidelines. So I do think that the Department of Education, or a department, whatever you want to call it, needs to do the record keeping. If they if a state does require standardized testing, and I think it's probably a good thing to do these little multiple choice tests once in a while. I mean, that is a different kind of thinking. But I think if the federal government just sticks with the record keeping and they send the Tennessee, these are the outcomes of of course, Tennessee is already going to know what the outcomes of their testing are. But if they want to say, if you want to compare another city in Ohio that's similar in population and other demographics, then you can kind of see where you're comparing to in regard to the educational testing. So I do think record keeping is good. I think definitely somebody needs oversight on some of these issues. Does it have to be the Department of Education? I'm not convinced that the Department of Education is doing a good job as it currently stands. I think it needs some kind of change, whether it's a total dismantling or not. I haven't really come to a conclusion mentally for myself.
I mean, until we have an idea of what the alternative is, I don't think anybody can make that judgment. And right now, like I said before, it's just tear down and hope that something is formed in the future that will be better. There's no plan to create something better, or there's obviously not a plan to reform the Department of Education. It's just tear it apart and take the pieces and move them around. But what does that look like? What does that mean?
Sure.
And that's just,
when people don't know, their mind makes up all kinds of things that they go on wild tangents. I mean, that's the way human nature is. But I do think it would at least be helpful if, when he is dismantling it doesn't have to be just the Department of Education, any of this stuff, that he identifies verbally written all the things that we're doing away with this, but this is going to come in its place. And here are our goals and how that will work, or something. Because otherwise,
yeah, but you're not going to get that out of this administration.
Not right now, I don't think. I mean, because we've just gotten that some of these, we have gotten that those programs that help disabled students and the Pell Grants and all that, those programs are going to continue. We've gotten that information, but we've not gotten much more. And so I do think it's important to tell your constituents, which happens to be the entire United States of America in this instance. You need to tell them what to expect, other than just trust me, it's going to get, difficult before it gets better.
It's going to be better. Well, and even with officials stating that these programs are going to be kept, if there's no direction on who's going to administer those programs, what departments those are going to be out of, I can't trust that they're going to be there in the same way, or they're not going to be a lot harder to access. And I think one of the things with this administration, with multiple changes they've made across multiple departments, is different benefits might technically still be there, but they're going to be harder to access. And when they're harder to access, you have less people use them and you spend less money.
And I mean, we could continue this discussion forever, because there's little nuances even to what you just said. And that's something we've pretty much agreed on, as far as I know, across the board, that there are so many things in our federal, state, local governments that need to be fixed, improved at the very least. And, if we're not active in our voting process, if we're not active in contacting our representatives, then things won't change, because they'll do what they think is best, or what they think you think, but they don't know what you think unless you tell them. So to close it off, Drew, because I've got to deal with this other thing, we would like people to like and follow our page.
Oh yeah, we need to be talking about that on the front end too. Yeah, so go to YouTube and subscribe. Don't just like the post, go to YouTube and or go to Facebook and like
Go
the
to
page. But
Yeah, go to
YouTube
those. It would
specifically
help.
is where we, yeah, that'll help.
Yeah. So
Anyway,
if you have watched this, please comment below if you've made it clear to the end. We would like to know who is watching our videos in entirety and if it's helpful to people. So just let us know in the comment section, and we appreciate y'all watching.
alrighty. Thank you.
All right.
Night,
Bye.
Mary Ellen.
Good night, Jim Bob. John Boy. Jim Bob.
Well, I think I already hit stop at this point. So
Have you stopped it?
I believe so. Let's see here.
Yeah, it says
there's a delay,
Yeah. So
it looks like it's getting ready to stop on YouTube.
okay.
Oh, no, well, I guess we're still streaming. We're just not recording. Anyway, I'll end the stream.
Oh, stop the streaming, because I'll tell you what's happening.